All right, welcome to the show, Nate Klemp.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, man. I'm psyched to get into your book, The 80-80 Marriage, and just to get to know you and learn what you and your wife are up to around teaching us about how to have good marriages. So
yeah, well, love that conversation.
Yeah, right on. So let me start with just who are you? How would you introduce yourself just to my audience here?
Yeah, well, I come to writing about marriage through a very non-traditional path. I was actually trained as a philosopher. So I have a Ph.D. in political philosophy, and I was a professor for about 4 years of political philosophy. And then something unexpected happened, which is I just basically completely burned out and realized that my life had become much worse as a result of all this philosophical training, whereas the goal at the beginning was to learn how to live a good life and ask the big questions. And so that got me very interested in what are the technologies we can use to actually experience well-being, happiness, etc. And that led me to yoga and mindfulness. And so for the last decade or so, I've been writing on mindfulness and started a mindfulness training company called LifeXT. That's now part of Mindful. And so that's kind of my background. And then about 3 years ago, my wife, Kaylee, and I got very intrigued by this idea of writing a book that's really about the unique modern condition of marriage. Mm-hmm. So that's what brings me here.
Yeah, amazing. And you're married how long now, you and Kaylee?
15 years. So 2006.
Well done, man. And you have one kid, I think, 2 kids?
We do. We have one daughter who's 9 currently.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. All right. Wow, philosophy to writing a marriage book.
As I said, not cool exactly jump. Where I thought I'd be. I thought I'd be writing about, I don't know, John Rawls or Thomas Hobbes or something right now, but here I am.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm imagining being a philosopher, at least part of you, a thinker. I imagine you're still have a toe in that world. Is that right? Or no? Are you completely like, that's like my old life?
Yeah, I have pretty much left behind the academic pursuit of philosophy. So I don't write journal articles or go to conferences anymore, that sort of thing. I do still feel like my work on mindfulness and on marriage is very much like part of my philosophical work. It's about how to live.
Yeah.
But it's a very different style, obviously, than what I was trained in.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of think of what I'm doing is it's still like there's a school of philosophy called pragmatism that I always identified with and was sort of my preferred way of thinking about philosophy. And so I continue to think of myself as a pragmatist. I'm just asking different questions, writing in a more accessible way, and trying not to be as boring as I used to be.
Okay. Now, do you get? I'm just going to like judge philosophers here, okay? And so I just want to get your take. Yeah. Some people, and I included, might judge a philosopher as historically maybe or traditionally heady and not emotional, which can then impact how you show up in a marriage. Would you describe yourself as that, or have you ever gotten that feedback from your wife, or like, gosh, Nate, you're just get out of your head and into your body, or start feeling, or is that not really? You're kind of a different flavor of like.
Yeah, I would say that my life has changed quite a bit in the last 10 years or so. But certainly during all those years of training philosophy, where I essentially spent 12 hours a day in the library reading philosophy, I was totally caught in my head. And I think about all of my fellow graduate students and these like luminary professors who were training us, and the level of emotional intelligence among all of us was probably as low as you could possibly get in a group of people.
Like engineers.
I don't know that you could find a lower level. You go to corporate America and people look like they're enlightened in comparison.
Wow.
So yeah, I feel like I've been transitioning out of my head and trying to get a little bit more in my heart and my emotions. But yeah, I'm probably still caught there a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate. I think it's sometimes a male thing, but often, some of us are just more wired on the left brain,
Totally. Yeah.
Let's talk about this kind of the modern marriage, you sort of called it there. And you guys take a unique angle in your book about this. So will you describe what you see as, when you say modern marriage, what do you mean?
Yeah. Well, I guess the first inspiration to write this book was just out of practical necessity. Kaylee and I were, we had a young daughter. We both had careers. We were both entrepreneurs. We were really struggling to figure out how to make sense of everything. And when we looked back to our parents' models and our grandparents' models, they were completely unhelpful for us. Yeah. I mean, they were living in a totally different time. They were facing totally different pressures. There was a very gendered model that they came out of. And so we really felt like we needed to figure out a better model for us. And then as part of the book, we ended up interviewing about 100 people. Mm-hmm. And we found that many couples reported something similar, that they were struggling to make sense of this new time. One of the things we say a lot is that it seems that the question of our time for couples is, how can you be equals and in love?
Yeah.
And I think many couples struggle with both sides of that, both the equality side of that and the in love side of it. And sometimes we strive for equality at the expense of love, which I'm sure we'll talk about more. But I feel like that's what kind of drew us to this topic of the modern, unique condition of marriage.
Yeah, and we're also full, man, right? Like just to get time together these days, for some of us busy entrepreneurs or parents, it's just a lot, right? To prioritize the relationship. I'm curious if that's something you found across those 100 interviews, is that people are so busy. Was that one of the, I'm just curious if that's what you found, is the busyness creates these, dynamics.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, the busyness thing came up again and again. And it was interesting because a lot of couples would report being busy, and they would report that they didn't have quality time together, but they often did have time together. So the dynamic that we heard a lot about was, the couples sitting there before bed, they both have their iPhones or their tablets out. They're both scrolling through Instagram or the, news or whatever. And so this feeling of being close but not connected seemed to be a pretty universal thing. And then you layer on the pandemic and COVID-19 on top of that, and it seemed to even amplify that, where all of a sudden, couples are close. It's not like you're, separated by thousands of miles for the most part, but the lack of connection often got even worse in those circumstances.
Yeah, close but not connected. That's a good kind of one-liner, right, about the modern marriage.
Totally.
Yeah, we're living together. We're kind of roommates. We're business partners in kind of raising the kids or dealing with our household, but we're not actually feeling like good together.
Yeah.
Who are you, and what are we actually about here? I'm curious, out of 100 couples, like what was the biggest surprise to you?
Well, one big surprise was, one of the things I asked most of these couples is, hey, imagine you're going to the bookstore and you're going to buy a book on marriage. What is it that you want to learn? And I thought they were going to say, I want to learn new communication skills, or I want to learn how to express my emotions more skillfully, or something like that. But it was very interesting that most couples said some version of, I want to learn that we are not the only ones struggling to figure this thing out. Because what they were saying is like, I look on Instagram or I look on Facebook and everybody else seems to be doing great. Yeah. There's all these posts about how amazing their partner is and amazing family vacation photos and things like that. And so it was interesting. Like a lot of what we were hearing is, I just want to know we're not alone.
Yeah.
And that it's not easy for other people, that we're all sort of struggling to figure this out.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, we do compare ourselves, right, on social media to everybody else's happy life, happy looking life. And we all know that that's bullshit, right? That's half the story.
Totally.
But still, we can feel bad, right? Like, oh shit, they have something I don't.
Yeah. And I started to realize that there's like individual envy with social media, but there's also couple envy. There's certain like couples that you start to envy because they've got more money and they can go on awesome trips, or they seem to be together all the time, or they never fight like us, and So it's like this other level or dimension of social media envy.
Total hashtag couple envy.
Couple envy, yeah.
I'll write that one down. And what would you say the biggest takeaway was interviewing 100 couples?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways that starts to touch on some of the themes of the book that, like, we talked to a lot of different couples and they fell on all sorts of different points of the spectrum, running from total disaster to amazing marriage. And one of the things we started to notice is that the more people would complain about their marriage and their partner and how it wasn't working, the more they started talking about how things aren't fair, or I'm doing everything, or they're not showing up, or kind of like pointing the finger at the other person. And it felt like they weren't really a team. Like they were just two individuals kind of caught in a power struggle.
Yeah.
And then on the other side of the spectrum, we heard a lot about, hey, this is really about the two of us as a team. We don't really think about what's best for me versus what's best for my partner. We think about what's best for the two of us together, what's best for our union. So ideas like shared success and generosity and things like that started to come up. So, it felt like when we were looking at what was going on structurally and the way people were talking in these interviews, we just started to see that there were some pretty striking differences between that high and low end of the spectrum.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's get into the fairness thing because I want to understand that. Yeah. And then we'll get into this term kind of 80-80 because I think maybe start us off with describing what you mean by fairness, that people struggle the most with fairness. Like, what does that mean? And then we can get into how you guys started to work with that and maybe offer a solution to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of an interesting concept because in the abstract, fairness is a really great idea. There have been a bunch of books on fairness in marriage. Fair Play just came out a couple of years ago. And it's a noble virtue to try to achieve some form of fairness in a relationship. So on one level, fairness is a really good thing. But what we started to observe in our own life and in the lives of these people we were interviewing is that there's also this other side to fairness, that there are certain behaviors that seem to go along with it. Things like scorekeeping and kind of like keeping a mental tally of how much you've done, how much your partner has done, how much you care versus how much they care, things like that. And that those behaviors and habits that I think all of us slip into on some level came out of this desire to make everything perfectly fair, perfectly 50-50. And for us anyway, and for a lot of the couples we interviewed, we started to see that attempt to achieve this fairness perfection was driving a lot of the resentment we were experiencing, a lot of the conflicts. And there was actually one really big insight that kind of led us to write the book in the first place, honestly. I was talking to a psychologist. He was the head of social neuroscience at University of Chicago. He now passed away. His name's John Cassiopo. And he was the one who tipped me off to this literature in psychology that basically shows that when it comes to our assessments of fairness, especially in marriage, we are clouded by all sorts of cognitive biases that get in the way. So there's this phenomenon of availability bias where, all of the wonderful things I do for my wife and my kids, all the drop-offs, all the, dishwasher unloads, all of that is available to me. But when it comes to my partner, a lot of it isn't. And so I have this tendency to systematically underestimate what my partner's doing. And then another sort of corresponding cognitive bias of overestimation, that when it comes to domestic work and childcare, we all have this tendency to overestimate how much time we're putting into it, how hard it is. So you take those two together and it starts to make sense why these battles over fairness never end, because we're bringing to the table essentially a data set that's based on pure delusion, right? Yeah.
It's just our subjective experience clouded with all kinds of filters, right?
All these filters, right? So when I say I did 50, it's probably more like 40. When I say I did 80, it's probably more like 60. It's like, it's very difficult to navigate those biases.
And you're saying people get stuck here because they're kind of mentally in their own mind, maybe without talking about it until the fight happens. They're keeping score, right? They're saying, God, here I go again. I'm the only one taking out the trash. I'm the only one doing this with the kids. I'm the only one whatevering. And over time, I add that up. And then when we have a fight, it all comes out, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think even when we don't have the fight, there can be this kind of, I'm sure you've experienced this before, this passive aggressiveness.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Like it's not an explicit articulation of the fairness thing, but it's sort of an implicit emotional barrier, a withdrawal.
Yeah.
And all of that, I think, one of the things we talk about a lot is that mindset is contagious. And so if you're caught in that fairness scorekeeping mindset, chances are that's going to be contagious and your partner is going to mirror that back to you.
Yeah.
And then, you just kind of like get caught in the feedback loop.
Totally. So I have a couple comments on fairness, but I first want to get to help the listener understand what the solution is here. And it's essentially, I think one of the solutions is this 80-80 mindset, which is very different than 50-50, for example.
Totally. Yeah. So you articulated that beautifully. If we're locked in this default pattern, many of us, of 50-50 fairness, one of the only ways out, we think, is to basically blow up the whole math of the equation. And we call it 80-80, and we realize the math there makes no sense. You can't have a 160 whole, right? Percent whole. Doesn't make any sense. And the idea is not that, oh, now I'm going to start doing 80% and contributing 80% and actually get there. It's more that if we sort of push the bar far beyond that 50% and shift to that mindset of 80-80, we also call it radical generosity, then we may or may not actually hit that, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that we're sort of doing something radical that pops us out of that paradigm of 50-50 and allows us to get caught up in what we think of as kind of like an upward spiral of generosity, where, if just one person in the relationship is a little bit more generous, offers a few more appreciations, your partner is going to likely mirror that back, and it can kind of create this very different culture.
Yeah, that's cool.
The basic idea behind 80-80.
Okay. So it's not necessarily, doesn't have to mean a strict 80% that we both do that. It's more like an aspirational quality that I'm going to overshoot 50% because that's who I am and that's how I want to show up here.
Exactly.
And if we both do that, we both win, type of thing.
Totally. Yeah. And if Kaylee were here, she would totally scold me for using this example, and I actually had this in the book, but we had a conversation about it, and I pulled it out. I love Aristotle. I was a philosopher, and Aristotle's whole idea of virtue was that virtue is sort of this middle point between too much and too little of something. And so in some ways, I always thought about 80-80 as similar to that we have too little generosity often in relationships. And what Aristotle would say is like the way to get to that happy medium point is often to overshoot the mean, to go way further than you possibly, can or that feels comfortable. And then you're likely to sort of end up somewhere around that happy medium. So I've always thought of it in that way, that it's kind of, a way of just sort of putting sort of pressure, disrupting our ordinary habit in a pretty radical way.
Yeah, I like it. And you talk about why in the book, why not 100-100? So I'm just imagining listeners are going to ask that question right now. So just exactly, so we can swipe that one off the table here. Why not 100-100? Yes. I think Gay Hendricks teaches that, or has taught that many years ago.
Yeah, Gay Hendricks. And I've seen that pop up a lot now. The more we've been talking about the book, the more I've been hearing, 100-100. And I think it's a cool idea. I mean, it's a similar approach of like, hey, let's really push the edge of generosity and see what happens.
Yeah.
What we say in the book, which feels right to me, is that you want to push your edge when it comes to generosity and sort of moving out of this trap of 50-50 fairness. And it's also important to take care of yourself, take care of your own needs, have your own projects that are important to you. So when I think of 100-100, there's almost like a hidden danger there of just like giving it all up and being so radically generous that you give up your own sense of purpose and things like that. And part of that is because we ran into some couples along the way when we were interviewing couples where, these were really striking interviews for me, where one person would say, I basically just gave it all up and then woke up one day and was like, how did I get here? How did I end up getting married? How did I end up having kids?
Yeah.
Like I just kind of woke up one day and here I am. And I never really, had a self along the way.
Yeah. I often find in those examples that the 100%er is usually with a 0%er. They're an overfunctioner. In other words, doing all the emotional labor, just trying to move the relationship forward and the other person's sort of dragging ass.
That's such a cool insight. I think you're absolutely right that, the 100 goes with a 0 or the 90 goes with a 10.
Right. It's kind of like this 80-20 principle, right? So I was also curious because clearly you've thought about the 80-20 principle because it's so true in so many environments, right? If you get a group of 100 volunteers, for example, you know that 20% of them are going to do 80% of the work.
Yes.
So I'm curious if anyone's misinterpreted this as like, well, where does what happens to the other 20%? And like, is that I'm only supposed to spend 20% on myself? And
yeah, we were a little bit concerned about that because the 80-20 economic principle has gotten a lot of play and it's a cool idea. I have not yet run into anybody who's been confused. And I think we tried to sort of not talk in those terms of like, what's your 80-20?
Right.
What's your 20% for you, 80% for, because we were worried about people getting confused and thinking, oh, well, shouldn't I be focusing on the 20%? Isn't that the whole thing of the 80-20 principle?
Well, and then your book title would be the 80-20, and it's like, what partner wants to be the 20%er?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and we actually do talk at the beginning of the book about the 80-20 marriage, where you essentially have one partner who's doing it all, the other partner who's not. So that's part of the model too in there.
Yeah, totally. Okay, let me circle back to fairness just for a minute. So I think I understand your guys' kind of the frame around fairness, and I agree with you that, man, people get caught up in scorekeeping, especially if they're in a hard place and struggling to be a team, right? Well, I'm doing more, and especially when it comes to things like logistics, finances, sort of a lot of the admin that goes along the business part of a marriage, right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you guys, and maybe I haven't gotten this far enough in the book, but I'm wondering what you think about the fairness principle around, I will not expect you to do all the emotional labor here. It does need to be fair for us in order to feel safe, for example, like the emotional safety that we want to have in our relationship where we both feel free to express ourselves, that has to feel fair. Like I can't do things to you that impact the emotional safety in a negative way because like that's not fair. We don't roll like that. So I'm curious what you think about that style of fairness language.
Yeah, I think you bring up something really important. And, it's interesting when we were thinking about fairness, and talking about the problems with fairness, in some ways, the problem isn't the ideal or the aspiration. The problem is the machinery that we've been using to get there. And so, the technology that we fell into and many couples fall into of scorekeeping and this kind of like very clumsy way of achieving fairness, I think in many ways that's the problem, not the goal itself. And so what you're articulating, I think, is really beautiful. And we talk about it a little bit in one of the sections of Radical Generosity, where we talk about this practice of revealing and how important it is from a place of generosity to reveal your full experience to your partner.
Right.
And that's like the good parts of it, but also the bad parts of it, the misunderstandings, all those like subtle breaks in connection that happen. And just a quick reveal often is all you need to get back into connection, and you can actually transform those moments into moments of growth. So I guess what I would say is, it feels like, especially around this idea of revealing, that we would be very much in line with what you're saying there. And one of the things that I think is important to note is that again, we're not like against fairness. I think we're just against this really clumsy way of getting there.
Totally.
And that there are much better ways of achieving fairness and equality that allow us to be fully revealed and allow us to add some structure around roles and priorities and even think more carefully about power and how we balance it. That those all end up being more skillful ways to get to that endpoint.
Nice. So let's use another example so I make sure I understand sort of your frames here. So let's say you and I are in a relationship, a partnership, and we get in a fight and I come back around and I take responsibility for, Nate, I raised my voice. I was kind of a jerk.
Yeah.
And you over there don't take responsibility for anything. And then let's say that happens a couple of times and I continue to say, hey, here's my part. And you say, well, yeah, thanks. And then you sort of turn your back and go into the kitchen or whatever. Yeah. That's going to feel very unfair, right?
Yep.
So that's totally not okay with me and my marriage, for example.
Yeah.
Like it's just straight up unfair. Like when my kids, fight, for example, they both have a part and we teach our kids like, no, it's got to feel fair to the other person around ownership, for example. It's never one way, right? But if I apply your 80-80 thing, I think you're saying that can still work if I am actually going to go above and beyond. Generosity is I take responsibility for my part in a very generous way, and you do the same. And that's this new, I don't know, fairness maybe not the word, but is that kind of what you're getting at here?
Yeah, well, I love your question because in some ways it's pointing to one of the trickiest things we had to think about in writing this book. And it was that dynamic you're talking about where you have one partner who's all in. They're like, 80-80. I'm going to take full responsibility.
Yeah.
I'm going to reveal my full truth. I'm going to be generous. I'm going to appreciate you, etc. And then you have this other partner that's just not interested.
Yeah.
And so we actually wrote a whole chapter called The Reluctant Partner.
Yeah, I saw that.
Try to unpack this dynamic. And one of the things that we started to realize is that there's really kind of like three types of marriages in this area. There's a marriage where both people are engaged. They're both like, hey, we're going to do 80-80. There's this reluctant partner challenge where you've got one partner who's all in and another partner who's curious but reluctant.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can work with that one. Yeah. There are ways in which as the more engaged partner, you can see like, how am I committed to this dynamic? How am I setting this up? Maybe just by being more generous, you can start to sort of break apart that dynamic a little bit. But then, one of the things you're articulating there is, what about the totally unwilling partner?
Mm-hmm.
You have one partner that's totally engaged and one partner that's totally unwilling. And I think, in talking to couples and thinking about this book, we came to the realization that there may not be a path to 80-80 there. I mean, maybe for yourself as the more engaged partner to be more generous, doing the things you already do, that could alleviate some of your suffering. But if somebody's totally unwilling, it's not clear what you can do in that situation.
And you're going to resent the hell out of them over time, is what I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a really good couples therapist can get you out of that one, but even then, I think it's difficult.
Yeah, I'm with you. Cool. So, I just wanted to clarify that.
It's a great question.
Hey, folks, good news. My new book, Getting to Zero: How to Work Through Conflict in Your High-Stakes Relationship, is available for pre-order. And here's what's cool. If y'all support me and you pre-order it, you get some cool stuff. Like I just recorded a 4-part mini video series on how to work through conflict, highlighting some of the chapters in the book. You can also get chapter 1 for free if you want to start digging in before the book comes out October 5th. So go to gettingtozerobook.com, gettingtozerobook.com. And thanks for being a listener and soon to be a reader of my new book. What if we come back to these 100 couples? I'm curious. I'd love to know for the listener, like what other findings, maybe particularly around conflict or sex, some of the bigger charged topics, right? That you guys learned that feel useful to share here.
Yeah, well, I mean, the sex thing is really interesting. In addition to talking to these couples, we ended up interviewing quite a few sex therapists and just really wanted to understand, how are these pressures of modern life showing up in the bedroom? And at a macro level, it was really interesting because I'm sure you're aware of all these statistics, this phenomenon of the sexual recession that, if you compare basically every demographic group today to 20 years ago, we're having significantly less sex than we were 20 years ago. And, so that was interesting. But then it was also really interesting to start to see that for many couples we talked to, it wasn't like they were experiencing a sex problem, like they didn't have the right technique, or they weren't doing the right, sort of like role plays, or they weren't using the right orgasm balm or something like that, right? Yeah. Like, it didn't seem that was the problem. It actually seemed that like all of the problems showing up in just these ordinary, mundane logistics of everyday life that were creating resentment, that in some ways, what was happening in the bedroom was almost like this mirror image of the rest of life.
Yeah.
And so, one of the things we ended up talking about a lot in the book is, because we're not like sex experts or therapists, and we weren't going to tell people, here's how you do this like advanced whatever technique.
Yeah.
But we ended up just exploring this relationship between the tensions and the conflicts in everyday life and how they show up in the bedroom, and how anything that sort of pulls you apart in terms of connection in everyday life is likely to show up in the form of not wanting to have sex, not having great sex, not being connected in sex. So that was, I think, really interesting for me. I hadn't really thought about it that way until we got a little deeper into it. Is that what you see? I'm just curious because you work in the field way more than I do.
Yeah, totally. I do see that. Basically, my wife and I really help people feel and teach people how to feel safe enough to be intimate, to be sexual. Yeah. Because a lot of people, the busyness of life, there's that, and the logistics and just figuring everything out, and the stress that we're all going through right now. Yeah. And heightened by COVID for most of us. There's that. And then there's also like the interpersonal stress that, if we're not dealing with conflict well on a regular basis, we're just going to be guarded. And so we're not going to want to open our bodies to each other. And that's just sort of, most people get that. So it's like, okay, the problem isn't, how to have better sex. It's how to open your heart again when you're guarded and closed off to your partner and you're resenting them. Well, you got to get through the resentment so that you can feel like really receptive and open to your partner and attracted to them again. So the work for us is always the on-ramp. How do we help people? And in our own marriage too, when we're stressed, it's like, we're not having sex. So how do we continue to stay open and receptive to each other and interested and safe,
I love what you said about how sex is this just like the ultimate invulnerability, where you're opening yourself up on all levels, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And it totally makes sense. Like, if you are shut down and closed in the rest of life, it's going to be really hard to just like in a moment decide, oh, now I'm going to totally open up to this person.
Totally.
It's like it's very hard to just flip that switch.
It is. And we actually interviewed Jamie Wheel, who his whole, the interview is really interesting, by the way. So listeners, nice. Him and his wife have a practice of no matter what, they have sex like daily. So if they're triggered, they just go right to sex. And I think most of us can't do that. That's a pretty tall order, but if you can, that's certain, and you're both on board with it, to sort of push through the triggers and resistance and get your bodies together. Because once your bodies finally get to that pleasure place, it can completely change your state, right? So it can certainly work, but I think most people aren't going to take that approach.
It was interesting. We heard a lot about that in the Christian community. We ended up interviewing a lot of Christian marriage therapists and sex therapists. And this idea of the sex challenge, the 7-day, 30-day, 60-day sex challenge, where essentially, as you say, you have sex every single day.
No matter what.
No matter what. And I've actually never done that for a long period of time anyway. But what people reported is that, it just forced you into connection in a way that for some couples saved their marriage. So
totally. It's one channel, right?
It's an experiment.
Yeah. It's one way in.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. A little bit more time here. I'm curious around conflict. What what was the finding there, if there was one that was maybe a common theme?
Yeah, well, there was definitely a big theme around this under contributor, over contributor dynamic that we talked about a little bit. So, there were several couples I can think of that were probably the most intense interviews just to be on the other side of, because I felt like in all these conversations, I would kind of have this window into their life. I'm sure you have the same experience with counseling and therapy where it's like, whoa, I can kind of feel what it's like in there. And often one partner, generally the woman, was talking about how they had basically taken on everything. I mean, there's one woman we talked to who she and her husband met in college, and her husband was one of these like frat guys who partied all the time, and his mom did his laundry on the weekends.
Yeah.
And so they got married, and she basically just fell into the role of
mom,
the mom wife, essentially, where, she was like half wife and half the person who did his laundry and booked his plane tickets. And that pattern then became entrenched for 20 or so years, and they never really got out of it. And so that was really interesting. And I actually think one of the most interesting things about that pattern is that when we would talk to the partner on the other side, the under contributor, you'd think like, oh, the under contributor, they've got it made. They don't do anything. Their spouse runs everything. Like, what a great situation that must be for them. But mostly they reported like it sucked for them too, essentially. That they were like, and in some cases they were like, look, I want to do more, but my partner has basically taken over control of everything and is unwilling to give me a chance, because if I screw up, then, they take it back. And so there was often like a lot of frustration on the under contributing side too, which I think is sort of underplayed in the current narrative around emotional labor, that it actually is really hard to be on the other side of that too.
Yeah, it's a really, really good observation there. And I make the same one in attachment dynamics, where you have a pursuer and a distancer, right? And a lot of marriages have someone like that. Someone's pursuing connection and the other one's kind of withdrawing from connection. Yeah. And so another common pattern, and often what gets looked at is the blame goes to the distancer, the person withdrawing. Right. But it's because the pursuer won't let off the gas and give the person any space to come forward, right?
Yeah.
So similar dynamic.
Well, and what I love is you're sort of in some ways going back to that 100% responsibility, Gay Hendricks style insight there, that's something we really saw in this under contributor, over contributor pattern, that, you want to blame the under contributor and say, God, if you just did more around the house, then you'd have a more egalitarian marriage and everybody'd be happy. But there often are subtle ways in which the over contributor is holding on to power and control and unwilling to let go of that. I mean, that happened with me and Kaylee early on. She was the over contributor. I was the under contributor. I offered to do our finances. She complained about doing them, but on some level, she didn't want to let go. And it took us like a decade before she was finally willing to let go. And I made mistakes and I screwed up, and she was, that was very hard for her and super edgy. But then we reached a point where, she was able to sort of let go of control. I was able to really take it on and get good at it. And then, it really changed our relationship.
Wow. That's a really cool example. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Is that another common one? Was it finances? Another one that seems to be pretty common challenge in couples to navigate finances.
Yeah. And I think with finances, it was really interesting that a lot showed up around power. So we would talk to couples where one spouse earned significantly more than the other spouse. And like there was one couple where the woman was the earned more. And she told me, she's like, I've never said this out loud before, but I decide where we go on vacation on all of our trips, because in my mind, I'm the one who's making the money. So I'm going to choose where we go on vacation.
Interesting.
and there was another guy we talked to who was talking about how his wife was a lawyer and she had out-earned him. And then all of a sudden he sold his company, and that was like a big payday for them. And he told me that in that moment, he felt like all of a sudden he had more sway, and they were talking about their finances, and he started talking about my money. Wow. And she's like, wait, I thought this was our money, right? So it was really interesting how like in the realm of finances, power showed up in really interesting ways around who was earning more, who sort of had a little bit more sway in how they made decisions.
Totally. Yeah. Money and power. Oh my God. Yeah. And you've talked about that openly in the book about your dynamic with your wife and your journey there. I'm curious if you'd be willing to share for you what that's been like, just on your growth path as a couple, how you guys have navigated that. I mean, you gave us the finance example, but just in terms of earning and taking care of the kids, because this is so the common dynamic, and especially when both men and women in a heteronormative marriage want to both maybe earn or have a purpose. And then it's like, well, then who's raising the kids? And that's such a big task anyway, whether we're doing a nanny or we're both tag teaming it. Yeah. So I'm just curious if you'd be willing to share your journey there.
Yeah, well, it has been a journey. And I mean, it really started at the beginning of our relationship. So we started dating when I was a graduate student at Princeton, making $20,000 a year, living in a dorm. Yep. And my wife was a consultant at Deloitte. And then from there, she became an executive coach and I became a professor. And sort of at every step along the way, she has had the more lucrative career. Mm-hmm. And initially that was very challenging for me because you've got gender dynamics. Obviously, you grow up as a male in our culture and you're told, hey, you need to be really successful. And so there's that whole thing. But then there are also these fairness dynamics layered on top of that, where we both felt, I think early on, that it wasn't fair that she was making more. And so that put a lot of pressure on me to think about like, okay, well, gosh, I need to figure out how to make more money, and this is a problem. And somehow my career choice is a problem. It's a problem that I decided to be a philosopher instead of an investment banker at Goldman Sachs.
Sure.
And I think the big moment where that shifted for us is where we started to think, instead of it's the two of us as individuals kind of against each other, what if we're part of a joint venture? We even named our family. It's super cheesy, I know, but we called it Kajona, which is the first two letters of each of our names.
Oh, awesome.
And we thought of it as like, what if this was just like our whole family is a joint venture or a business or, something we're trying to impact the world with.
Yeah.
And instead of thinking about like, how much am I bringing in? How much are you bringing in? We think about like, what's the best decision or arrangement of roles for this larger entity? And that was like a huge breakthrough for us. It was actually at that point where I was working at a startup at the time and I cut back to 80% time because that's what made the most sense for our family. And it allowed me to be at the bus stop and pick up our child in the afternoon.
Amazing.
And so that was a huge shift for us from that kind of individual power struggle to shared success. And I would say now we think of everything as like, hey, how are we going to win together? Does that make sense to prioritize what you're up to? What should I be doing? And it's really not about anymore who's making more, who's making less.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, that's also, I think, in a way, a developmental task that the couple needs to move through is how to, it's kind of in a way like, how do we move from me versus you to collaboration and where whatever we do, we're all winning here and we're a team, Yeah. It's very mature, like it's a maturation process.
Yeah. Yeah. And that one, boy, if we could have done that earlier on, we would have saved. I mean, we almost got divorced based on that.
Yeah. Wow.
Like,
right.
There were moments where it got so intense and it just felt so inescapable that.
Yeah. That's so vulnerable. I
mean,
mean,
we just couldn't find our way out.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably what you saw with a lot of the couples you interviewed, right? Is this me versus you? Like that mentality doesn't get very far, right?
No, and it's so
sinking
painful.
Ship.
There's no way to win, because if I win, then you lose. Like the whole definition of the problem is set up to ensure that somebody loses.
Yeah. Yeah. So. Yeah. Well, again, I'm grateful that you got this book out here, 80/80 Marriage. I want folks to check it out. We'll have you share a little bit about where to find that here in a minute. I have one more question for you, just a personal curiosity about mindfulness and how your own journey with mindfulness is helpful raising a family, raising a child, and being in a marriage. Will you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, mindfulness is a big part of what I do. When I'm not doing 80/80 marriage, I'm a founding partner at Mindful Magazine. And so a lot of my career, a lot of my own personal practice is sort of bound up in that mindfulness idea. And for me, on my journey, I mentioned getting to a point in my academic career where I just totally burned out. And I realized in that moment that I didn't know how to manage my own mind, which was a really sobering realization, especially for somebody who spent 10 years at these very prestigious universities trying to, master their mind.
Mm-hmm, right.
It was like the ultimate failure, really,
right.
realizing that. And so mindfulness became a really powerful thing for me because it just gave me a set of tools for understanding how to navigate like the inevitable stress and overwhelm of life. And so yeah, I mean, I think like, since then I've had a pretty consistent formal mindfulness practice, but there's also this second piece of mindfulness, informal mindfulness or integrated mindfulness. I think of it kind of like mindfulness and the craziness of everyday life. Mm-hmm. It's probably been the most important thing, which is just like that ability. And I still screw up all the time and I'm not perfect at this. And I'm like getting very, very slowly, incrementally better, but just that ability to catch myself in those moments where I feel triggered or I feel reactive, mm-hmm. and just like to open up a little bit of space around it and to see it and to bring some awareness to it. Like that has been one of the most powerful things I think for me in my marriage, because it's just saved me from so many comments that would have landed really badly or,
right.
Just like the thing you want to say, but you kind of dial it back and you realize you don't actually want to say it. So yeah, for me, mindfulness has been really powerful. Kaylee, if she was here, she'd tell you like, hey, I don't really like to meditate. She likes to walk around the lake or go on a hike.
Sure.
And that's how she clears her head. But for me anyway, it's been a very powerful tool, and I can't imagine life without it, honestly.
Yeah, man, I'm with you. I was a Buddhist meditator for many years.
Nice.
Just hardcore Vajrayana Buddhist practitioner.
Nice.
Falling off the wagon there, but it's a longer story. Anyway, I'm a big proponent of mindfulness and meditation. In particular, in the work I teach, we're really helping people self-regulate.
Yeah.
When they're triggered, basically.
Yeah.
In relationship, right? So giving people tools to be able to be with their experience, right? The emotions, the thoughts, the sensations, the kind of all the stuff that comes up for us when we're activated. So I'm with you. I just want to shout out to any kind of mindfulness practice for the listeners. Enormous.
Yeah. It's, as you say, just that ability to stay in discomfort instead of doing what we habitually want to do, which is somehow ease our own discomfort by lashing out and pushing back and saying the things we don't want to say. I mean, like that ability is just, it's very difficult. It's so edgy. It's so uncomfortable, but it's so powerful too.
Yeah, exactly. I'm with you. Well, cool, man. Nate, where do people find you and your book and Kaylee?
Yeah.
What's the best place to find you guys?
Probably the best place is we have a website, 8080marriage.com, and we have some free guides on date night and things like that. We also do quite a bit on Instagram. I actually think that's how we met. We connected over Instagram, Jason.
Totally.
And in terms of the book, 80/80 Marriage, you can find it pretty much anywhere, Amazon, local bookstores, etc.
Okay, excellent. Cool. We'll put the links to that in the show notes. And what's the Instagram handle?
80/80 Marriage.
Cool. 80/80 Marriage.
Yep.
Great, Nate. Well, hey, thanks, man. It's been awesome connecting, and thanks for doing all that trench hard work to help extract the goods from all those couples and help us.
Well, thank you. Amazing questions. And also thanks for all the work that you and your wife do. It's really amazing stuff.
Yeah, you got it. Action step here for you. Go to the 8080marriage.com and make sure you follow 8080 Marriage on Instagram and check out Nate and his work there. I'm also going to check out Mindful .com personally. And check out their book. If you resonate, I think this is cool. I always like interviewing people like Nate because he's not a therapist, right? He's not a relationship coach. He's not a relationship expert. He's married, 15 years, has a daughter, and him and his wife wanted to find a different solution and to their challenges. And so they applied themselves and then wrote a book and interviewed a ton of couples. So I thought this was really cool. I want you, here's your action step, to try on the 50-50, 80-80, or 100-100 to see which of those kind of mindsets do you want to step into. I really like 80-80. I have taught for years 100-100 because Gay Hendricks taught me that many years ago. And I really liked it. It made more sense than 50-50 to me. Because 50-50 people get into this scorekeeping of like, I feel like I'm doing 70%, you're doing 30%. And I don't know, it's human nature, of course, but it's kind of it's a little mind trickery to go, what if we both put in 100? And that's in a way a fantasy. No one can put in, I don't know. I mean, we're just all so full. Like, can you really put in 100% all the time in your marriage? I don't think so. So 80-80 seems realistic. I kind of like this. So try it on. Have a conversation with your partner if you're partnered, and if not, if you're single, have a conversation with someone who listens to this podcast or a friend, and be like, I kind of want a marriage like this. And then share your biggest takeaway from the episode. All right, I thought there was a couple good ones in there. Well, several. Sweet. And as always, thanks for subscribing. Thanks for listening. Make sure you subscribe because that helps us climb the algorithm and reach more people. If you feel inspired and served here and you haven't left a review yet, my ask is, will you leave us a review that's positive, saying, hey, this has benefited my life, And you do that pretty easily on Apple Podcasts with your thumb even. You can just write a sentence. Cool? Okay, everyone, thanks again, and blessings on your day, morning, evening, and we'll talk soon. If you're in pain relationally and you need immediate support, our coaches can help you. I've trained almost 100 coaches at this point, relationship coaches that are amazing humans, and they have the chops to help you get through this hard time, this hard moment you're going through. Or if you want to actually hire a coach and have someone in your corner to continue to up-level your communication skills, your listening skills, your conflict skills, these folks are incredible, okay? So all you need to do is go to relationshipschool.com/MRC. That stands for My Relationship Coach. So relationshipschool.com/MRC, all right? If you want immediate, direct, effective help. Hey, thanks so much for listening. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Share one of these videos with a friend. We want to help the planet get their act together around relationships. And you are one of them, so thank you.